Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Lee Williamson. I'm the president here at the FCC. According to Mark, since 1800, no country in Europe has lost as many of its citizens to emigration as Ireland. Mark's journey with the country began, I believe, when he was a teenager and he discovered his Irish heritage, and since then has been on a journey on what it really means to be Irish. After extensive travel, particularly in the 70s, where he covered the Troubles, he moved to Asia in 1978, where he has remained ever since. His life has been about documenting the Irish diaspora through his many, many books. His latest, Out of Ireland, chronicles his personal life journey and the people that he has met from the Irish diaspora throughout his travels. He's here to speak with us today about his latest book, Out of Ireland. Mark is going to speak for about 30 minutes, and then I'll come back to invite you all to ask some questions directly to Mark. But please join me in welcoming Mark O'Neill.
Thank you very much, Lee. Thank you to all the staff here at the club for arranging this event. And the FCC has been a great supporter of our books. We've done many presentations here, so I'm extremely grateful. Now, we've chosen the title Out of Ireland for the reason that Lee has just said, because of this mass emigration that began in the 1840s. And in 1841, the Irish population was 8.1 million. The Irish population today is 7 million. So I think there's almost no country in the world with a lower population today than it was a century ago. So the diaspora, the people who left and their descendants, are the people that I find in my book. And as well, as you know better than I do, many of them have prospered and done much better after they left home than when they were there. Okay? So here's my father. He was a psychiatrist in London. He was a very charming, humorous man. He had quite a few defects as well, but we won't speak about them. Anyway, it was 1962, it was December. My sister and I were sitting with him at the dinner table. He'd had about 4 glasses of wine. He wasn't drunk, just merry. And he said to us, would you like to hear a speech by Eamon de Valera? Now, father did not speak with an Irish accent at all. He spoke only in this BBC official accent. So we'd never heard him speak in anything other than that. So we said, yes, we'd love to hear a speech by Eamon de Valera. So for 5 minutes, he gives us a speech by de Valera, who was the president at the time. And de Valera comes from County Clare, so father had the intonation of County Clare. So after 5 minutes, he said, would you like a speech by the Cardinal, who was called Dalton? We said, yes, we'd love to have a speech by the Cardinal. So father gives us another speech. Cardinal Dalton comes from County Armagh, so his intonation is slightly different. So after a 5-minute speech by him, father says, how about a speech by the Ulster Prime Minister, who was one of our relatives, actually, Captain Terence O'Neill. So he gives us a speech by Captain O'Neill. And this would be father's real voice, because that's where he grew up. So for the first time, my sister and I realized that our father is not the person that we thought he was. So we asked him some questions, and we learned that he spent the first 6 years of his life in China, in Manchuria, where his father was a missionary. Then he went back to Belfast for his schooling. He was educated there. He went to Queen's University, and he got a diploma in medicine. And then he moves to London to become a psychiatrist, and he discovers that with his Irish accent, he cannot get a job, especially in medicine, which is very elitist, and arrogant. So he hires a teacher, and he learns this very official BBC voice. Now, I later learned that this is not at all unusual. I'm sure many of you know Margaret Thatcher did the same thing. Edward Heath did the same thing. John Major did the same thing. Not to speak about Scottish people or Irish people or people from Europe. Because if you want to join the upper echelons of the British society, this is what you have to do. Okay? But he didn't like to speak about his past. He didn't like to speak about his father. He kept very few links with his family members. So I had to do my own research, go to the library, meet other people, to try to understand something of this past. And one day there was a party which my father attended, and there was a man there called Brian Inglis, whom you may have heard of. He was quite a famous author. He was from Dublin, but he left Dublin and made his career in London. And I was 14 years old, and I said to him, "Oh, Mr. Inglis, you are Irish." And Mr. Inglis became rather angry. He said, "No, I'm not Irish at all. I'm West Brit." So I was 14. I didn't, I mean, people in the room know what it means, but I really didn't know what I mean. So it becomes quite a complicated question. So this is the photo of our first visit to the Republic of Ireland. That was in the early 70s. This is County Mayo in the west. I went with another student, and we took a bicycle, and this is what we saw. In secondary school, I had a friend from Edinburgh who was a supporter of this football team. Now, where is this football team based? Edinburgh, right. Thank you. Now, you know the saying, how the saying goes, you can change your wife, you can change your job, you can change your house, but you can't change your football team. So I've stuck with Hibernian until now. And I did a bit of research into Hibernian, and I discovered that it was set up by an Irish priest in 1875. And at that time, because of the famine, Edinburgh, Glasgow, the other big industrial cities in Scotland were full of Irish Catholics who'd run away, and they were at the bottom of society, and they were doing very tough jobs. And he set up this football team, but he couldn't find anyone to play them. Such was the prejudice against Irish Catholics. So finally, Hearts, which is the other Edinburgh team, they agreed to play them. So that's how the team began. So then, 1975, the opportunity came to go here. Where's this? This is the City Hall of... Thank you. So this is the city where Father grew up and where Grandfather grew up, and where Grandfather, especially in Grandfather's time, it was one of the most important cities of the British Empire. It was a huge producer of engineering, linen, tobacco, and of course ships. What was the most famous ship that it produced? Thank you. It produced 3 ships like the Titanic. So unfortunately, the Titanic is the famous one because it went down, but the other 2 all had a long and distinguished career. So it was a very important, very wealthy city. So the opportunity came to work there. So I thought, this is a very good opportunity. I can work there. This is the time of the Troubles. And I can also begin to do some real research into my family, because I will be there. So I went there for a week, like explorations, and I was introduced to Des Wilson. He was a Catholic priest in the Ballymurphy area, and that's a very run-down parish in West Belfast. Unemployment rate is very high, and it was a real breeding ground for the IRA, because there was no work. So the young men all gravitated to the IRA. So I asked Father Wilson, I said, could you introduce me to a family? Could I live with them for a few days? And he said yes. So he introduced me to a family, and I stayed with them for 3 nights. And it was a way of finding, can I survive here? Can I work here? And so I lived there for 3 nights, and the man had been out of work for 25 years. 25 years. His wife was a cleaner, and they had 3 sons. And the father was so discouraged, he didn't really like to converse very much. But his wife talked a lot. And she said her main purpose in life was to prevent her 3 sons from joining the IRA, because the IRA actively recruited people in Ballymurphy. So she said, I've got to find other avenues for them, other jobs, other vocations for them to do, or even emigration also. So this week was such positive time. I was so well received by this family. I thought, yes, I should go for this. So I applied for the job, and luckily, I think no one else applied for the job, so I was able to. So we're now in the middle of the Troubles, right? So I don't want to talk too much about the Troubles, because that's in the past, and it's very sad what happened, but just a few images, okay? This was an IRA poster. Now, I learned in the Troubles that those of us who were journalists, we had a lot of privileges. You know, in the Troubles, 3,500 people were killed, thousands of people were injured, maimed, but no journalist was killed. No journalist was killed. And the reason for this, I think, is that both sides needed the journalists because there was also a propaganda war, of course, going on. So I discovered that we could go anywhere. We could go to the Protestant side, we could go to the Catholic side, we could go to the British military side. We couldn't go to the Provisional IRA, we couldn't go to the British military operations. I mean, that was off limits. But everything else was accessible. So it was most instructive. And of course, none of my family or my relatives, my classmates from the UK, nobody came to visit, not once. But it was a wonderful period. So, as I say, my other purpose to go to Belfast was to find out about my father and grandfather. So this man was called Reverend Jack Weir. I don't know if you know him. He's a Presbyterian minister. He was the chief administrator of the church for 20 years. And he spent much of his early life in Manchuria. So he knew father, he knew grandfather. And there's a photo of his father, and he lived his whole life in Manchuria. He was a missionary, so he was same time as grandfather. Now here's another test for you. Who does this belong to, this bed cover? What's this symbol? Thank you. Which emperor? Thank you. Very good. You win the prize. You win the prize, yeah. So I asked Reverend Weir how he acquired this bed cover. As you know, in the war, Puyi was the emperor of Manchukuo. So at the end of the war, he was arrested by the Soviets, and they took him to a labor camp. And all his belongings were worthless. So they were thrown on a flea market in Shenyang. And Reverend Weir was in Shenyang at the time, and he went to the flea market, and he bought this bed cover for nothing. So this was a retirement home in East Belfast where he was living. So when Reverend Weir died, he died under the bed cover of Puyi. So I learned a great deal from him about the whole mission in Manchuria and my father's place in it, and my father also. And Reverend Weir was also a hero during the Troubles as well. He tried to be a mediator between the IRA and the Protestant side and the government. And that's another story. We won't go into that today. So this is another eminent Presbyterian minister called Reverend Dunlop, and we're still in touch. And he also was extremely helpful to understand about grandfather and the mission in Manchuria. And he was a minister throughout the Troubles. So he gave us a very good understanding of what happened in the Troubles, you know, and the front line. Because we journalists, we tended not to interview the widows of those who'd been killed. But that was his job. If a RUC man was killed, a prison officer was killed, an innocent Protestant was killed, he's the one who would go to the house and meet the family. So now a couple of images from the Republic. We used to go there for like R&R. Now, if anyone can tell me where this is, they get a prize. Which county is this in the south? This is County Kerry. It's Listowel. This is the only railway in the world where the line is upright. So I went to visit a farmer called Mick Barry, and he was a railway fan. So in his garden, he had several pieces of this line, and he had even a train, you know. And at that time, Ireland had just joined it's now the EU, it was the EEC in those days. So I asked Mick to explain how Ireland had changed because of the EEC. So he started telling me all about the policies and so forth, and I couldn't really understand. He said, look, to make it simple, he said, in the morning I get up, I walk out to my front lawn, and the green paper drops from the sky. What he meant was this is the agricultural policy. It meant that everything he produced, he was a dairy farmer, everything he produced was sold. The local creamery had to buy it at a minimum price. So this completely transformed Irish agriculture because there was a minimum price for all the produce. Previously, half of the days that Mick went with his milk to the creamery, they didn't want it, so he poured it away. So the Irish economic miracle that we see today started at that time. Now, this is a priest at Croagh Patrick, you know, the Holy Mountain, like Fatima or Lourdes, where handicapped people go, chronically sick people to go, they go there looking for a cure. So now we move to Hong Kong, okay? Can anyone tell me who this is? This is Sister Mary Aquinas. She's a Columban sister. She came here in 1950, and she and 11 other Columban sisters, they were the main reasons why TB was eradicated in Hong Kong. It was an extraordinary achievement that they did. I'm sorry, this table doesn't tell the whole story. This begins in 1961, but if it was 1945, TB was the #1 killer in Hong Kong, so it would have been up here. So just during her time, TB fell right down. It's probably the biggest single achievement by Irish people in Hong Kong ever, by those 12 sisters. So there we are, yes. Amazing. So at that time, there were about 3,000 Irish in Hong Kong. I interviewed quite a few of them. Jesuit Father Patrick McGovern, he was a member of LegCo. He was the representative of the working class of Hong Kong. I mean, that's a pretty amazing thing. You have a foreign priest who represents the working people of Hong Kong, but that's how colonies are, you know. So now let's move into China and move up to Manchuria, where my grandfather was. So thanks to all I'd learned in Belfast, I had some knowledge now of what my grandfather did. So in 1986, I was reading the People's Daily, and there were a list of towns which had been opened in the whole of China, 240 of them. I looked under Liaoning, and Faku, this town that grandfather was, had been opened, which meant that I could go visit. So that we went there in May 1986. So this photo was taken in the 1930s. They're standing in front of their house. They got there in the early 1900s. They lived there until 1942. They built a church, 2 schools, a Western hospital. One of the schools was for girls, and previously there were no schools for girls at all in that time. So he lived through the Great Manchurian Plague of 1911, which killed 63,000 people. I mean, somewhat similar to COVID. The Revolution of 1911, the Japanese occupation, until he was finally put under house arrest after Pearl Harbor, and then 1942 he was sent back to Ireland in exchange for Japanese prisoners. So he had an extraordinary life, and I think a very positive life. So here's a photo of one of the graduations from his school. And here's a photo of our visit. This is May 1986. Now, the town had been closed to foreigners since 1948, when Lin Biao's army conquered that part of Liaoning. So these children had never seen a big nose before. So it was like being Michael Jackson for 3 days, you know. So they asked me a lot of questions. Your nose is so big, how can you breathe? You have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 openings. Which do you use to eat? And the third one, you answer this one. In your country, does everyone speak Chinese? What do I answer? Yes, yes. Everybody speaks Chinese. Oh, they were very happy to hear that, yes. Okay. Anybody know who this is? This is President Hillary visiting Beijing 1987. Sorry, 1988, that's right. This is Liam Casey. He's the most famous Irish businessman in China. Wait a minute. His company is called Pacific Coast Highway. He spends most of the year in Shenzhen. He's a very remarkable individual. Now, anybody tell me what this is? Yes. What ship are they building? We mentioned it already. This is the Titanic, right. This is a one-on-one copy of the Titanic, which is being built in Sichuan, $156 million US, 1-to-1. And it's not going to sail anywhere. It's just like, it's a tourist attraction. You go there and spend 2 or 3 nights there, you know. So I'm afraid in the area of Xi Jinping, I think this project is not going to fly. I think that money is lost. Now, you all know who this is. And what's the venue? Anybody? No, not Manchester. He's visiting. What are we talking about today? Thank you. What's the biggest stadium in Ireland? Crow Park, that's it. So this was an initiative of the Irish ambassador in Dublin. He knew that Xi Jinping liked soccer. So he said, take him to Crow Park, give him a football, tell him to kick it, and get it televised. So this image was all over China, all over the newspapers and the TV. Very good advertisement. Now this is, do you know the man in the middle? That's right. So he's visiting a dairy farmer in County Mayo, yes. So this was an advertisement for China, for Irish dairy products. So since 2006, I'm in Hong Kong writing books. As my wife says, mo mai chok. It's a good way to lose money, unless you can get some commission or sponsorship. So he was the subject of one of my books. I don't know if anybody can recognize him. It's called Sir Robert Hart. We call the book Ireland's Imperial Mandarin. And his profile is very similar to grandfather. He's from the north, very tough guy, learned Chinese very well. And he ends up being the head of the Chinese Imperial Maritime Customs for 48 years. That's a department of the Chinese government. And they produce 25% of government revenue in some years. So he set up an organization like the United Nations, of course, mainly Chinese employees, but Germans, French, Norwegians, British. All the foreigners had to read and write Chinese. And in history, no foreigner had ever held such a post, nor will they in the future. An amazing story. And his love life is also very interesting. He had a Chinese lady friend with 3 children. But then for his career, he thought, this isn't going to work. So he gives her a lot of money and then marries a very appropriate Irish wife and has 3 children with them. So if you read my book, you'll see the battle to try prevent the 2 families from meeting each other. There were some quite close shaves. So let's come back to Hong Kong. This is a very eminent Jesuit priest, Father Alfred Dinan. I don't know if you've heard of him. Yeah. And he's passed away now, but there is a prize for social entrepreneurship, which is named after him, which is still in operation. Education is a very big contribution by Irish priests to Hong Kong. So we have the Jesuit schools, and this is the La Salle School in Kowloon Tong. And I think we can say these schools transformed the lives of the students. I mean, their parents, many of them were refugees. They had no chance to have a formal education. But thanks to the schools that they went to, which were in English, the graduates were able to get professional degrees. They could join the Hong Kong government. They could be lawyers, doctors, accountants. And many of them, of course, emigrated. So they have alumni associations here and in Toronto and in Vancouver and in London. And they give large amounts of money to the school because they are so full of gratitude. So then we have the consulate here opens, 2014. So this is the first St. Patrick's Day parade. Of course, everybody knows her. She's the most famous Irish person in Hong Kong. No, she's a great ambassador, really a great ambassador. Now, finally, let's go to the Chinese in Ireland. Who can tell me who this is? She was the mayor of Dublin, Hazel Chu. She's the daughter of 2 Hong Kong parents who met in a restaurant where they were washing dishes in Dublin. And her mother is a tiger mother. So she was determined that Hazel is not going to have the life that she had. So she had to study, she had to learn computers, blah, 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 you know. So she did very well. She became a lawyer. She went to join the Green Party. So she finally became the Lord Mayor, 2020. And there's no other capital in Europe which has ever chosen an ethnic Chinese as a mayor. I think that's a great sign of tolerance. Now, this is in Donegal Pass in Belfast, and this used to be a Presbyterian church, and now it is a, yes, called the Water Margin, yes. This is the church for Chinese in Belfast, and this has no risk of closing. This is full of people. So Taiwan people, mainland people, Hong Kong people, you can have services in Cantonese, Mandarin, or in English, just bursting with people. Yeah. And my experience is the first generation work in restaurants, laundrettes, very tough jobs, and their children become professionals. It's very remarkable how quickly they improve. Lee, how much time do we have? Just a few more minutes. Okay. So this is not such a good story. 1999, after the Good Friday Agreement, the Irish government passed a new law saying if you are born in Ireland, you have an Irish passport. Well, as everybody knows, the snakeheads, you know, the mafia are scouring the world for opportunities, and this was one. So many Chinese, especially illegals, when they were pregnant, they went to Belfast or Dublin and they had their babies. So we had many cases where the child is an Irish citizen, an EU citizen, but the parents are both illegal. And according to the Irish Times, some planes arrived from Nigeria, and the ladies were almost there. So they took a taxi rapidly to the rotunda, and the baby was born just in time. So the law was changed in 2004, but by then, 9,500 of these children were born. So now, after Brexit, the Irish passport is definitely the best in Europe because it gives you access to all the EU countries, and you also have access to the UK because there is a bilateral agreement. So there's no other country in Europe gives you this access. This program was very popular with Chinese. You can see like over 95% of the applicants were Chinese. So they finally closed the program this year because Ireland is now so wealthy, it doesn't need this additional money. So finally, we have to end on a comic note, okay? Now this is Mr. Yu Ming from Shenyang. So one day, Mr. Yu Ming said, I'm bored with my life. I'm just a shipyard worker. I'm not earning any money. So he bought a globe, and he's turned the globe around, and he put his finger. Oh, and the finger landed on Ireland. So he goes to Wikipedia, and Wikipedia says the official language of Ireland is...
You started that lie many years ago.
So Mr. Yu Ming, he learns Gaelic. Then he flies to Dublin, and he enters the country, and he goes to a pub in Dublin, and he starts to address the staff in Gaelic. And they're saying, is he speaking Chinese? Is he speaking Japanese? But luckily, there was one guy there from Galway, so he could converse with him. So he takes Mr. Yu Ming to the Gaeltacht, and now he's working there. Now this is actually a movie. It's not a real story, but I thought it was a wonderful way of laughing at yourself. Anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. I'm going to ask one question to give everyone time to rack their brains for theirs, and then we'll open it to the floor. Mark, there were so many fascinating reminiscences there across such a life well lived. Recollections, stories of resilience, recollections of ingenuity, recollections of humor. What would you say is one thread that goes through all of your different stories, as varied as they are, of Irish citizens around the world?
Well, I think you've described it. After he retired from China, Sir Robert Hart went back to Ireland, and everywhere he went, he was feted as a big hero and a famous person. And in all the speeches he made, he stressed this point. He made jokes about himself. He said, if I achieved anything, it was because of my Chinese staff and my foreign staff. I'm nothing important. He made jokes about himself. So he made great achievements, but that didn't make him arrogant and think well of himself, and he laughed at himself. So this I greatly admire. So my father said the same about his father. I mean, he was rather serious, of course, being a missionary, and he didn't drink, he didn't smoke, but he told lots of jokes. So I thought this was very, very good balance.
That pinch of humor.
Yes.
Being a thread through everything.
Yes.
Fantastic. Who has a question for Mark? The gentleman over there. There's a microphone coming to you, sir.
Hello, Mark. I'm To Hanshi from Headland Intelligence. I don't require you to have exact number or data, but do you think the Scottish people also emigrated from Scotland a lot to places like Hong Kong? And I mean, while I don't require you to have numbers, how do you compare the level of Scottish emigration out of Scotland to places like Hong Kong compared to Ireland?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. There was heavy emigration from Scotland, but there is a difference because the British did not develop industry in Ireland except in Belfast, except in the north. Ireland was always an agricultural country, very big families, so immigration was very high, and of course the Great Famine was a catastrophe. 1 million people emigrated. Whereas in Scotland, there were very important industrial cities, so Dundee, Edinburgh, Aberdeen, Glasgow. So, yeah, there was high immigration, but it's not quite the same And dare I say, the Scottish people are not as humorous as the Irish. Can I say that? Okay, let me give you an example.
I feel like the next question might come from that gentleman.
You heard the story of the Dutch and the Irish? If the Dutch occupied Ireland, it would be the Garden of Europe, and all the Irish would drown. All the Irish would drown. Drown, yes. Well, Holland is very low-lying. It's only kept there by all the dikes. So. Sorry, that didn't work. So that's
Any other?
Okay, sorry. Okay.
Any other questions or jokes that anyone would like
or
to
jokes.
contribute? Yeah. Lynn.
Lynn Mulholland. I'm originally from Northern Ireland. Actually, we attended a talk at the FCC last Monday about the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition, and I noticed that most of the examples, except the Columban sisters, are male. Can you talk about how the women coming out of Ireland have contributed, and particularly from Northern Ireland? I believe that other conflict zones looked at the Northern Irish Women's Coalition to be an inspiration on how they could actually involve more women in conflicts and resolving conflicts. And I just do want to say one thing about no journalists having been killed in the Troubles. There was actually, very sadly, a case in 2019 after the peace process with Lyra McKee, who unfortunately was killed in Derry, but she was a female journalist. But that was after the peace agreement. Thank you. But your comment on women coming out of Ireland, please.
The Columban sisters were supposed to go to mainland China, but after 1949, of course, all the foreign missionaries were expelled. So the Columban sisters came here. So Sister Mary Aquinas and her group were the most famous because they tackled tuberculosis. But the other Columban sisters did great work in hospice care, in helping to rehabilitate drug addicts. They ran secondary schools. And maybe the most remarkable is one for sex workers. This was a lady called Sister Anne Gray. Actually, she's from Scotland, actually. I mean, she's a Columban sister. So she went to Chim Sa Tue, Mongkok, where the ladies walk the streets, and she stayed there, and she got to know the ladies with great difficulty, because, of course, the pimps didn't want them to talk to anybody else, and they were suspicious. And so she set up a help group. It's called Action Outreach, and it's thriving today. And the aim was to help them with health problems, education problems, give them an exit if they wanted to do it. And it's an extremely difficult mission to have. But they did it, and they built it to the point where they could get a lot of funding from corporates. So now it's in a very healthy condition. So that was another remarkable achievement by these lady missionaries from Ireland. As for the North, I'm not quite sure what to say. I mean, the Presbyterians to which my grandfather belonged, their missions were in Manchuria, in Korea, and in Taiwan. But I can tell you in Taiwan and Korea, the Presbyterian Church is extremely influential and has had enormous impact on society. So among the missionaries would be important women among them. Yeah.
I think we have time for one more question. The gentleman back there.
Okay, hi, Mark. Where do you see the Irish in Hong Kong and the Irish roots that have been laid here going in the future? I ask because the missionary aspect is closely associated with colonialism, imperialism, concepts which don't sit very well going forward. And I just wonder, do you think there's any danger of such a history and heritage being airbrushed?
You make a very good point there. To prevent this happening, I am at this moment writing a history of the Irish in Hong Kong. of which the missionaries and Protestant and Catholic will have a very important place, because I think their contribution has been very, very significant. And I think it's intellectually lazy to say that they and colonialism are the same. I mean, it is true to say they were able to come here. No, it was easier for them to come here because this was a colony. But they also went to many countries which were not colonies. It was easier for them to come. But I think the work they did is independent of the colonists. And from my understanding, the missionaries didn't live like the other expats. You know, they didn't live with other foreign people. They lived closely with Chinese people. They lived in the schools. They lived in the hospitals. They lived as close as possible to the Chinese people. So, no, I think it's a very positive contribution. And, but you're completely right. Unfortunately now, the way the history is moving, I think, yeah, they may be brushed out. And I went to the Hong Kong Museum of History on the final day of the Hong Kong history story. You remember that? There was a very good exhibition, ran about 5 years, very good. And on one gallery, there was photos of all the governors. And you couldn't get onto this gallery because all the Hong Kong Chinese visitors were taking photos of all of them. So I asked one, I said, why are you so interested in all these governors? And they said, well, it's obvious, isn't it? You know, we'll never see them again. These photos will either be destroyed or they'll be put in a crate in the basement and never be seen again. So we've got to take the photos now. So the history is being changed. So I would ask whoever writes the history to make a clear distinction between the religious and the other expats. That's what I would say.
That's Mayor Cayman, but time for one final question.
Yeah, so your topic was obviously on Irish impact on Hong Kong and China. Can you just talk a little bit about the impact of Hong Kong on Ireland? I know you touched on the Dublin mayor, but are there any other noticeable trends or hubs of culture or anything like that we can see in Ireland as having originated from Hong Kong?
Well, now Ireland is an extremely prosperous country. So many Chinese people from Hong Kong or from mainland are going to study in the Irish universities. And if they're in computer science, high-tech, fintech, pharmaceuticals, they can get high-paying jobs in Ireland. So I would say that at the moment is the biggest contribution the Chinese are making. They're participating in this. One of the most famous chefs in Ireland is from Hong Kong. He was the son of a man who opened a restaurant in County Donegal, and that's where he grew up. But now he's become a celebrity. He's on television. He has his own brand of foods. He runs very high-class restaurants. I mean, he's household name. So, I mean, he's a very good example of someone bringing all the best of Hong Kong cuisine to Ireland. Yeah.
Hong Kongers were also big customers of the shipyards.
Yep.
Thank you so much, Mark, for those lively, colourful, insightful reminiscences. It's been a real pleasure to hear them today. Please join me in giving a big round of applause to Mark O'Neill.
Now, you can't leave without buying at least one.
We have a small gift for you there. I was also about to mention, Mark, I'll do the sales pitch for you, that Mark has some books outside as well as out of Ireland, which we've been discussing. There's Lunchtime, a number of other of his books, and Mark is happy to stay behind and sign some of them for you as well. On Wednesday, I'd like to remind you, on the 14th of June, we have another club lunch, this one, a panel on the future of the district councils, attended by a member of LegCo as well as a couple of district councillors. Should be a very interesting talk. Please do join us then. Now, thank you so much, Mark, and thank you for joining us. Thank you.
Okay.